Hello, everyone. Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we explore the lesser-known but crucial chapters of world history. Today we travel to the early 20th century in South America to analyze the revolution of the Little Ox, a Bolivian peasant uprising that in 1907 reflected the indigenous struggles for land and justice in a country marked by great inequalities. This event, although less mentioned in international history, symbolized a cry of resistance in the Cochabamba region that would lay the foundations of a peasant social conscience and become an inspiration for future generations. To understand this uprising, we first need to contextualize the situation of that time. In 1907, Bolivia was going through a crisis of social and economic inequality rooted since colonial times. The urban and landowning elite had political and economic power, while the majority of the population, made up of indigenous peasants, lived in conditions of extreme poverty, without access to rights or representation. The social structure had hardly changed since independence in 1825. Thus, the majority of arable land belonged to a minority of large landowners who controlled the peasants under quasi-feudal systems, and Bolivian society continued to be divided between a well-to-do minority and a marginalized majority. The Little Ox Revolution arises in the midst of this crisis of land ownership. The exploitation and expropriation of indigenous lands had been going on for decades, and in many areas, the ancestral lands of the native communities had been absorbed by latifundia, pushing peasants to work in conditions of servitude. On the haciendas, the peasants were not only forced to give up their lands and work long hours for derisory wages, but they were also subject to the laws imposed by the landowners. These conflicts over land and living conditions generated growing resentment among peasants and indigenous people who saw the need to resist the oppression of large landowners as increasingly urgent. In this context, the figure of Macario Orellana emerges, an indigenous cacique from Cochabamba and charismatic leader of the community who symbolized the aspirations for justice and dignity of the peasants. Orellana, deeply committed to the cause of his people, had spent years organizing rural communities to fight for their rights. Under his leadership, the peasants of Cochabamba began to plan secret meetings in which they discussed the possibility of an uprising against the system that subjugated them. Thus, the Little Ox Revolution took shape as an organized reaction to the system of oppression and a response to the dispossession and historical humiliation that the indigenous people had been suffering since colonial times. The name Little Ox was symbolic, as the ox represented the hard work, perseverance, and sacrificial life of the indigenous peasants. Although small, the ox symbolized the strength of the community that, united, sought to make its demands heard. The peasants, although considered insignificant by the elite, were the ones who sustained Bolivia's agricultural economy. The Cochabamba region was a key nucleus of this resistance due to its economic and social structure. The economy of the area depended heavily on agriculture, with products such as corn and potatoes. However, production was controlled by landowners, who imposed their rule on the peasants. The situation was untenable. Indigenous people were dispossessed of their ancestral lands to expand the haciendas, which exacerbated community resentment. Peasants suffered both from the economic abuse of the landowners and from the constant pressure to evict. This widespread exploitation and contempt for indigenous rights ultimately motivated the action of the peasants of Cochabamba. In 1907, after years of abuse and impoverishment, peasant leaders, led by Orellana, decided to act. In clandestine meetings, they planned an armed uprising, the aim of which was not only to demand the return of lands, but also to bring about a change in the living and working conditions of the indigenous people. The revolution proposed to question the authority of the system, and the government aligned with the interests of the landowners. The call for rebellion also sought to challenge the economic and social power that landowners had in the region, and which Bolivia's central government unconditionally supported. Thus, the revolution of the Little Ox broke out with protests and attacks on the haciendas in Cochabamba. The peasants, armed mainly with agricultural tools, took control of some landowners' properties and demanded the redistribution of occupied land, as well as an end to oppressive working conditions. The government's reaction was not long in coming, and it was violent. At the time, Bolivia was ruled by liberal regimes that promised to modernize the country, but its structure was dominated by the landowning elite. The Bolivian government, seeing in the revolution a threat to the established order, sent military forces to Cochabamba to put down the revolt. The peasants fought bravely, although at a disadvantage. Finally, the uprising was brutally suppressed. Peasant leaders, including Orellana, were captured and most of them executed. Despite the defeat, the impact of the Little Ox Revolution was profound and long-lasting. Although the peasants did not achieve immediate change, this uprising sowed the first seeds of social consciousness among the rural population. Bolivia's indigenous peasants began to recognize their power as a group and to demand political and economic rights. The revolt ushered in a new era of peasant movements, which would inspire the agrarian reforms of the mid-20th century, particularly during the National Revolution of 1952, which would change Bolivia's agrarian structure. The peasants' demands in 1907 centered on land redistribution, better working conditions, and political rights, would become key issues in Bolivian politics in the decades that followed. Although Macario Orellana and the other peasant leaders did not see these changes, their struggle laid the foundations for Bolivia to experience a profound social transformation years later. In addition, this uprising had a significant impact on indigenous identity in Bolivia. For centuries, indigenous people had been excluded from national power and politics, and this event was one of the first collective manifestations of indigenous resistance, which helped to strengthen an identity and political consciousness among the original peoples of Bolivia. This feeling of identity and inclusion would persist in the peasant and indigenous struggles of the 20th century. The effect of this revolution also transcended the borders of Bolivia. In many Latin American countries, peasants faced similar struggles for land and rights. Thus, the Little Ox Revolution of 1907, although repressed, represented a first step towards social justice in Bolivia. Her message of resistance, justice, and dignity is remembered today as a symbol of the struggle for indigenous and peasant rights. We hope this story has given you a new perspective on the history of Bolivia and on the struggles of peasants and indigenous people for their rights. If you liked the episode and want to continue discovering revealing chapters of the story, don't forget to subscribe, activate the bell, and leave us your comments. We'd love to hear what other historical topics you'd like to explore here at Untold History. Until next time.